I think it all revolves around one thing, and that is that we live, the adults live a whole life. And what does that mean? That they can be congruent with one another, that they can love one another openly, that they can be real with one another, and that in their relationship with each other, they form a context in which the child has a chance to be nurtured in this kind of context, not have to take sides with their parents, as happens so often, not have to be subject to what they should be and aren't, but rather that we really make the family a real garden place, and that we work on something that I know is possible, which is that we can be loving to one another, we can be real with one another, and the family is where you get it.
Virginia Satir is Director of Training for the Avanta Network. A noted lecturer and therapist, she is recipient of numerous honorary degrees. Her writings include People Making, Conjoint Family Therapy, Self-Esteem, and Helping Families to Change. Today, she shares some of her central views on the quest for peace. You've indicated that conflicts that we face are our avenues for hope. What are you trying to share?
What I'm trying to share is the fact each of us is unique, so there is no way in the world that we can be with another one without coming into some kind of differentness. So that looking at the differentness and being able to find ways to share it becomes a fantastic gift. Think of what happened in the world today if we were all met everybody who was just like us.
Given the fact that conflict is an avenue for hope, you've thought about the family. What role does that have in shaping behavior?
Well, I want to start off first with a negative use of it. For many people, the presence of conflict is the same as saying, I don't love you. And so then what people do, they don't want that to happen, so what they do is they try to get rid of the conflict. And they don't find ways that they can make it into something that is very useful. And the family is the place where we learn about how to deal with this. So one of the things that I try to do, first of all, is to help people appreciate that you are a unique being, all the others are unique beings, and what's coming out is like information that we can use to help one another.
You've written that troubled families are the crucible of troubled individuals. What you've thought about the family, does it do? Conflict in a negative sense is one form of destructive work. What else occurs?
When you were talking, let me tell you the image that came to mind. All of us are born little, and we all have to depend on the people around us to help us. The people that are helping us are just using whatever it is that they have learned. And most people in the world have learned from very early time that the way in which they're supposed to be is to conform and obey to whatever anybody asks them to do. That that's the definition of a whole person, or a good person, let us say. Well, if that's all I ever learn, to conform to what you want and to obey what you tell me, I never have a chance to learn about my uniqueness. And so my uniqueness is going to crop out anyway, but the way that it crops out within that kind of a frame is to come out in belligerence or to come out in resistance or something of that sort. And so we never discover the marvelous things underneath. This is what causes the trouble.
You had a number of metaphors in your writing to help convey insights into the family and human behavior. I'd like to give you some of the major ones one at a time and ask you to explain what you mean. First, the pot.
Oh, that's wonderful. First of all, just let me give you a little history on that one. When I was a kid, I lived on a farm, and we had one of those great big marvelous black pots. And in the spring, that pot held fertilizer for my mother's bedding plants. And that had been accumulated over the years. Then in the summertime, it was cleaned out, really cleaned out, and for the freshers who would come, we'd put food in it, soup or something like that. It sometimes was even used for food for cattle. It depended on what we needed. Then the third use of it during round butchering time is when we had a lot of fat rendering and so on, we made soap in that. And I began to think, when I was looking for ways to try to help people to understand something about self-worth, that it had something to do with feeling full of something, full of your feelings of worth. Now you can make 3 S's out of what I just said: soup and soap, and the third ingredient, which was they had to do with the fertilizer. And we all have all these things. So it was a shorthand way for people to take this metaphor, and it was easier for a husband to say to a wife, "How's your pot today, dear?" And it would not be offensive. It would be kind of like a little invitation to humor. At the same time, the message would come across.
And you've analyzed people with low pot. Who are they and how they get that way?
Low pot is a person who does not feel they're worthy, who does not feel that they're lovable, and feels almost constantly that they're rejectable. And of course, so they bring out those kinds of responses because that's where they come from, and they then do get a lot of rejecting behavior. Now, for me, people get low pot because when they're growing up, they don't hear in the reflections in people's voices, in their eyes, and in what they say and do with them, that they're of value. See, one of the big things, John, that goes on in this world is that people think that real education is by pointing out what's wrong with you. And so when we hear enough of that, we begin to feel that we aren't worth anything.
How do you acquire high pot? What do families do to grow children who are high pot children?
Well, I'm going to act like I got a recipe book, which I don't, okay? First thing is that you know that the child is a person. Almost immediately after birth, the child hears, sees, just like you and I. The only thing they don't do is how to translate this into any kind of symbols that we recognize. So we need to remember that we have an interacting human being, a person. Then the next thing, and then we treat them as a person. Then the next thing we do is we sharpen our ability to listen, to hear what's going on, to see what's going on before we make judgments. I often use the metaphor of the gardener. I think parents need to be good gardeners, and that means that what does a gardener do? A gardener takes seeds, and it never says to the seed, now listen, if you don't grow in a way I want you to grow, I'm going to throw you out. They don't do that. What they do is they take that wonderful seed and they say, now I got to find out what are the growing conditions of this. What's the light and what's the fertilizer and what is temperature? And that's what I would like to see people do with children, because everyone is unique. So how can the parent use their powers of observation to be able to see what is this new little being that's coming into being? And when you do that, you spend more time in listening and in observing than you do in judging. The other piece to that is a willingness to share what goes on in the parent. For instance, so many parents think that they have to be paragons of virtue to their kids. They never made a mistake, or they never get upset, and la la la, all these questions. Well, actually, that's not true. You know that, and I know that. And parents have a mistaken idea that that's the way they can model, that there's a time at which none of these things occur to people. In fact, actually, when a parent talks to the child about how they make mistakes, and how, and what they feel like when they do it, and how a mistake can be an entry to a new possibility, because you can learn from that.
You've used an illustration of you're too young to really understand, referring to what parents say to children that really doesn't help.
That's right.
Why?
Well, I worked out a 3-point thing about life. Between the ages of just birth and 18 or 20, you're always too young to. between the ages of 45 and death, you're probably too old to, according to this. And so that only leaves those times between 20 and 45 where you're supposed to be okay, whatever that is. So if you spend the first years of your life getting experiences of being too young to, where do you develop a sense of your own adequacy and competency? You don't. And so people wait until that magical age, which is between 21 and 45. Well, they enter it when they need to have these feelings of competence, but they don't have them. So then they have to develop them. But then, midway between, they look ahead and they say, well, you know, when I get to be 45 or 65, something like that, I'm going to be too old to. So what's the point?
Another one of your metaphors is the metaphor of tapestry.
Yes. I start from the principle, John, that every one of us is a unique being. We came here by the activity of two other people. Each of those people is a unique being. They join their uniquenesses in some way, which becomes like the loom upon which I, as a child, will begin to develop the form and the design that I will be for myself. So if my parents or the people around me are conscious of the fact that they are unique beings with their own vibrations, their own tastes, and their own ways of doing things, and they can be a reservoir of help to me as I bring what I have in my design flows on the tapestry, and it's mine, it's no one else's.
I like to return to each of those metaphors and ask you to indicate the role of the family to create experiences that will lead to a more peaceful world. Let's start with the metaphor of the pot. How can the family act to develop a pot that is a pot for peace?
All right, let me dance between two things. First of all, let me say that the world is peopled by adults, and those are all children grown big. And where do we learn about how to deal with conflict? We learn it in the family. What do we see out there in the world? We see the same thing that we see in the backyard with two little boys saying, if you don't like what I'm doing, you go home, see? Or I'll kill you. Something like that. All right. Those are reflections of how conflict is handled in the family. That is the same as what we see out in the outer world. Okay. So, in working with the family, by developing this idea that about our uniqueness, about our worthiness, about our need to feel that we count, then what we are doing is making a new picture for what adults can be, because adults carry into adult life what they have learned as children, and if they don't learn anything else, they're going to carry that same thing on with the world outside of them.
In parents' role as gardener, what do they need to do to contribute to children who will work for peace?
Well, I think I can put it in a couple of ways. One is, if they get delighted about what their new seeds are bringing them. One thing that comes to mind is the negative thing that happens because a child doesn't measure up to what the parents expect. Let me give you an illustration. A lot of times there are little girls who much prefer to ride horses and play competitive sports rather than play with dolls. There were little boys who were very much interested in doing painting and doing sensitive things than they are in doing the rough macho stuff. All right. Now, those are properties of an individual's uniqueness, but if they come in a family where people don't honor that, then they have to try to erase that. Another illustration is that in some families a child is more like, let us say, an older grandparent or who was in disgrace, or one who was, let's say, a Nobel Prize winner or something like that. The children get surrounded in a context that does not permit them to show what they are capable of. One of the things that I try to help parents do is get excited about the possibilities for their child, just like you do with a seed in the garden that I talked about before. And looking with appreciation at all the new possibilities. That means you have to start out with an attitude that permits you to see what's there instead of you to try to put there what you hope will be there. And so that wonderful thing about also waiting. Waiting to know that it takes a while for the seed to sprout. It takes a while for the seed to unfold itself. And in the meantime, you go on trust, just like a gardener does. You go on, you plant a seed and you go on trust that it will grow. And the same thing is true with parents and family. To be able to be patient, at the same time to allow themselves to observe without judging. I have to say one more thing. The other day I ran across a young man who told me that when he was 5 years old, it was quite possible for him to look at a page and memorize it, no matter how big it was. When he told his parents about it, they couldn't believe it. Now, he had a skill and he had a gift that his parents didn't have. Fortunately for him, even though they found it hard to believe him, at the same time, they were interested and they didn't squash what he was doing. Some people would have gotten scared. See, John, I think that we are just beginning to touch the possibilities of what a human being can be. And since we've been so busy to ask people to conform and obey to what we want, we haven't had a chance to see what all the other possibilities are. What possibilities we have for bonding, for uniting, for leading, for building with one another. We're just beginning to find those out.
Yours is essentially a message of hope that if the pot isn't full, if the gardening hasn't worked, if the tapestry is not woven to reflect an individual's uniqueness, that change is possible. What's the role of the family in relearning?
Now let me preface that by saying, see, it is no longer for me a matter of possibility, what you say about change. I know it is a fact. It is an observable fact. I have worked with people for up to the age of 104, from 2 weeks on to 104, and I see what change is possible. Now, you ask, what is a change possible? First of all, it's a change in an attitude in ourselves. That we can get a connection with the life force within the two of us. That thing that makes it possible for us to live, to feel our sense, to sense what's going on. That's one of the things that happen. When I get more connected and more aware of you as a live being and me as a live being, you as a miracle and me as a miracle, because isn't life a miracle in and of itself? Then what I begin to do is I shift from being a controlling person to somebody who is empowering. And so the whole notion of how I can empower you, and if you're my child, means I listen to you, I respond to you from my own real self. I am also able to let you know about certain realities that I see that maybe you don't. But it's within a sense of appreciation, of joy, and of life contact.
You've really written that communication is the heart of beginning to bring about change. How should people learn to communicate? If you were to articulate the major goals you hope to contribute to peace, what would they be?
Well, first I will give you the form, and then I will give you the essence. The form is that when I connect with you, any you in the face of this world, I am connecting with you with the attitude that at that moment in time, you are the full focus of my attention. And therefore, all my being is focused on you. That means I'm looking at you, I'm not thinking of somebody else. I am listening to your words, I'm not making them up. I am feeling free that I can share with you however this comes off. And in doing so, I am developing a context around us that makes it really possible for us to share whatever it is that's going on. I made a tape once between two people, and I had them accept from the beginning that they were supposed to behave as though they understood each other, whether they did or not. This became an experience in such irritation that before very long they were ready to kill each other. See, if we can't share what we're feeling, then we have to make it up.
Urge that people not avoid anger, that they deal with it as something that can be the beginning of real communication.
Let me tell you about anger, for me anyway, because I remember I made everything up, I'm telling you. Anger is our emergency emotion. It's one of our greatest friends. It comes up when something's off, when we're overcome with some feeling of helplessness, or we're overcome with a feeling of outrage. It's a very important emotion that says to us something's out of order. All right, we need that, just like we need the red light in the car that says, hey, watch, your gas is down or your brake fluid is down or something. That's a very important function. Now, when we can honor that and let ourselves know and articulate the fact, I'm angry at this moment. I don't say you made me angry. I simply state this. And then I can then take a look at what it is that's going on, and I might be able to share that with you. Some of the greatest bondings come about because people have shared on that level of things. There's nothing I can do about anything that happens, certainly around you, or even around myself, unless I make it clear what's going on.
You've written that what you've learned you can learn again. What are the major implications of that for creating people who value a more peaceful world?
In our world today, I think that the majority of the world is governed by something I'm called a hierarchical model, which is that some people know and some don't. Some people are big and some people are little. And so that kind of an experience in the world means that people cannot be equal to one another. And not being equal to one another, in a sense of their value with each other, then they go on perpetrating this kind of thing. And it shows up in the haves and the have-nots in the world. So when we can in the family to reinforce the idea that everybody in the family is equal as a valuable human being, different and same in many ways to each other, but never identical. So we separate the physical part from the essence part. The physical part being your different color, skin, your different height, your different weight, and so on. Those are all physical characteristics from the value feeling that you as a being and I as a being are equal in value.
You've intertwined in your writings is the notion of divinity. How do you think about spirituality and divinity as they relate to creating a more peaceful world?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm going to start out with something. When I see people in a coffin, they've got everything they had before, but one thing, life. They can't move. So, and life is something we cannot give ourselves. It's given to us. Where does it come from? For me, it's a part of the divine order of the world. And therefore, life is, by its very expression, a manifestation of spirituality. That's our base, our spiritual base. And I don't know how it happened, but somehow we got off that track. And I think it may have happened because the excesses of religion, which left those that did, left the spiritual base, which has to do with this, we're all the same in that value, and went into who is acceptable and who isn't acceptable. And now what I believe is that we're really coming to recognize that all of us, but all of us in the world, come from a life source that we do not create.
You've reflected on what your fellow professionals should do differently to contribute to a peaceful world. With all we've talked about up to now is the beginning. What do you want them to think about and how do you want them to act?
Well, first of all, what I like every professional to know is that they're doing a sacred job. They're doing a sacred job because they are connecting with the life of another person, and that requires the utmost in responsibility and caring. Then I would like them to know that every human being that they touch is going to touch other people, and that they themselves have a perspective on the world, that what's out in the world are just people, nothing else, just people. And that I cannot sit by and think only of what's going on in this little circle. I have to think that we have to look at the various contexts in which we're all a part. And so when I think about myself as wanting to help, let's say, a person to begin to no longer be psychologically ill, but to be active and effective and joyful, that same thing I need to work on in the world outside of me. So it's hard for me at this point in time to make a differentiation, or let us say a boundary, between me as a therapist and me as a world citizen.
This returns to the theme that's dominated in your writings, and that is the family as a source of great hope for the world. What do you want your fellow professionals to teach families in the decades ahead to have a more peaceful world in the 21st century?
I think it all revolves around one thing, and that is that we live, the adults live, a whole life. And what does that mean? That they can be congruent with one another, that they can love one another openly, that they can be real with one another, and that in their relationship with each other, they form a context in which the child has a chance to be nurtured in this kind of context, not have to take sides with their parents, as happens so often, not have to be subject to what they should be and aren't, but rather that we really make the family a real garden place, and that we work on something that I know is possible, which is that we can be loving to one another, we can be real with one another, and the family is where you get it. You know, John, without day-to-day models of people doing what they espouse, children particularly don't learn. I know families where they espouse all kinds of liberal values, except they don't have it in their own home. You know about things like that?
That's not where we begin. You've thought about what you want your fellow citizens to do to create a more peaceful world in the 21st century.
Yes,
What are your hopes?
My hopes are, and I already see some hopes that are going, is that every person will start to think of themselves as a worthy being. And I say to people, in the morning when you get up, bow 3 times before your mirror and say, the world is a better place because I am here, and then live as though that were true. And that means you have to like yourself in order to do that. And that's a big switch, because many of us were brought into this world that the self was not very likable. Never did understand. How come I could like you if I didn't like myself?
Thank you for sharing with us today your insights into the role of the family and the human being in creating a more peaceful world.